stronger position vis-a-vis Tunisian Islamists than Egyptian liberals were vis-a-vis Egyptian Islamists. And we see this, this is a kind of part of the conventional wisdom. So in 2014, the New York Times had this long story trying to explain why Tunisia's ended well and Egypt hasn't. And the author said, well, in Tunisia, Islamists and secularists were relatively evenly matched. Consequently, each side needed the other to govern. In a more scholarly vein, Eva Bellin, who is here with us today, has testified that the fact that no party enjoyed a majority in Tunisia provided an incentive for coalition building and accommodation in Tunisia that you did not have in Egypt. Al Stepan has noted that in the Tunisian case, the Ennahda party was kept modest by the fact that it fell short of a majority in the Constituent Assembly, and therefore it needed to form a coalition. Egypt, in contrast, Islamists have a supermajority, and so they were able to run roughshod over everybody until the military was forced to intervene. So the idea here is that in Tunisia, balance of power, that's salutary. In Egypt, no balance of power. So the question is, where did this come from? Why was Tunisia more balanced between Islamists and secularists than Egypt? And I want to examine one explanation for this, which is that this was a function of differences in the electoral rule. Okay, so in Tunisia, the interim authorities settled on a system of closed-list proportional representation. Everybody here probably knows this already, with 27 districts, average district magnitude of about 8. In Egypt, in contrast, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, which was the interim military government, in negotiation with political parties, generated a kind of hybrid electoral system where 2/3 of the seats were allocated through the same closed-list proportional representation system as you had in Tunisia, and then 1/3 according to a majoritarian two-round system that you had had in Egypt for a long time. And so lots of people have made the argument that this difference in the electoral system, pure proportional representation in Egypt and this weird hybrid, pure proportional representation in Tunisia and this weird hybrid in Egypt, that was responsible for some of this difference that we observe. There was just an article in the Washington Post this week that made this argument, and it actually said that, because Ghannouchi, the head of Ennahda, he actually gave up the option of choosing some more majoritarian system and opted for PR, and that helped lead to the wonderful balance that we saw in Tunisia. Professor Bellin argued again that the relative balance of the parliament was in part a product of elite agency. The decision, she says, by the Electoral Commission to embrace a system of proportional representation rather than a majoritarian first-past-the-post single-member district electoral rule. John Kerry at Dartmouth goes even further and makes the argument that it's not just that Tunisia didn't pick majority rule, but that they picked a particular form of proportional representation, the hair quota with largest remainders, which he says had enormous consequences for the outcome because it actually benefited smaller parties. And he actually does this study where he uses district-level data to simulate what would have happened under different forms of proportional representation, and he finds that under some alternative forms, Ennahda would have gotten a supermajority, and so you would have had something that looked very much like Egypt. And there's a Tunisian scholar, Hadi Trabolsi, who does something similar. So in this narrative, if you're still with me, in this narrative, had Tunisians picked a different set of rules, had Tunisians picked a different set of electoral rules, they might have found themselves under a different kind of environment. They might have found themselves with the kind of Islamist dominion that the groups like the Muslim Brotherhood were able to achieve in Egypt, and then consequently the things that happened in Egypt might have happened here, where secularists would have withdrawn from democracy. By the same token, it could be reasoned that if the Egyptians' armed forces had chosen pure PR, just like the Tunisians did, they might have produced an electoral landscape that was as balanced as the Tunisian one, in turn generating the incentives for compromise that we observed in Tunisia. This is the argument about how these institutions might have mattered. However, despite these testimonials, I think there are strong reasons to think that institutions should be assigned only very limited causal weight in our explanations of the ultimate outcomes in these two countries. So in the case of Tunisia, the choice of proportional representation or of the hair quota, which ostensibly staved off Islamist dominion, is in my view probably best viewed as a function of the relative balance of power between Islamists and secularists in that country, rather than as a cause of it. Because remember, the bodies that actually drafted the electoral rule in Tunisia, these included, from the outset, healthy representation from parties and civil society groups that would have had an interest in mitigating the dominance of the Islamists. And the reason it had heavy representation of those groups is because they mattered in this country in a way that they did not matter in the Egyptian case. So of course it makes perfect sense that they would consciously choose an electoral system that would improve the fortunes of smaller non-Islamist parties. In other words, in here, the electoral rule is an effect of the relative power of non-Islamists in the Tunisian system, not a cause. I think the evidence for this is even stronger once we start looking at the Egyptian case. So remember, Egypt has a different system from Tunisia. It actually has what we call a parallel or a mixed system, where 2/3 of the seats were selected according to proportional representation, and 1/3 was selected according to this majoritarian system. Now, the proportional representation system that Egyptians used to elect 2/3 of their parliament was exactly the same system that they used in Tunisia. So we can actually conduct this nice little test. We know what would have happened in Egypt if we used proportional representation, because they did for 2/3 of the seats in parliament. And what happened if we just restrict ourselves to looking at what happened with the proportional representation tier in the Egyptian parliament, we see that Islamists got a supermajority in that tier as well. Now, in the majoritarian tier, the Islamists get 80% of the seats. But in the proportional tier, they get 67% of the seats. So even if, in Egypt, you had picked the exact same electoral system that you had picked in Tunisia, we would have gotten an outcome that looks substantially similar to the outcome we got in Tunisia, which is an Islamist supermajority in parliament. So the point I'm trying to make here is really simple. In the case of Tunisia, the electoral rule might have helped avoid Islamist dominance, but the fact that it was chosen was in part due to the fact that Islamists were not dominant. So the political institutions were a reflection of the relative power of parties rather than a cause, or to paraphrase Professor Jaworski, who I honestly did not know was going to be here when I wrote this sentence, underlying balances of power shape institutions, and institutions only transmit the causal effects of these underlying balances of power. So in Egypt, I'm making the argument, Islamists were so powerful relative to their opponents that it didn't matter what electoral institution you had, that they would have dominated regardless. And so what it suggests to me is that any explanation of the divergence between Egypt and Tunisia should turn away really from these proximate things like the kinds of political institutions you had, and look at this question of the pre-existing distribution of power between Islamists and their rivals in each country. And so in the remaining minutes I have, I want to just throw out a potential answer for why we had this different balance of power, and that does not hinge on institutions. So I want to make the argument that the source of this difference was deeper, that the monolithic Islamist landscape that proved so ruinous for Egyptian democracy, and the relative pluralism that proved so beneficial to Tunisia, were actually functions of the different structures of those countries' civil societies. So this is we're using a lot of World Values Survey data in this conference. So this is World Values Survey data on membership, organizational membership in Tunisia and Egypt from the most recent wave. It's not great data, because what do you notice? Basically, Egyptians aren't members of anything, and Tunisians join things in small numbers, but compared to the Egyptians, they look like Robert Putnam's ideal type joiner, right? So that's the first thing we notice. In Tunisia, there's a lot more civil society membership than there is in Egypt. The other thing we notice that in the Egyptian case, the biggest poll, the biggest group that people are reporting membership in are churches or religious organizations. Now, look, it's less than 1%, okay, so it's not a lot, but to the extent that people are saying that they're parts of any kind of organization, they're more likely to say religious than anything else. except for parties, that's true, but that's true. In the Tunisian case, however, there's a lot of membership, and labor unions, for example, in Tunisia almost 2%, in Egypt 0.3%. So there's more membership that is happening in Tunisia, and there's lots of scholarship, social science scholarship that notes that this is important. So Jean Cohen and Andrew Arado made the argument that a highly articulated civil society with cross-cutting cleavages, overlapping memberships of groups, social mobility, this is the presupposition for a stable democratic polity and a guarantee against permanent domination by any one group. So in Egypt, the argument I want to make is that you actually had a very weak civil society that was dominated by Islamists. And this data doesn't actually capture it, because when you ask people in Egypt what kind of organization are you a member of, they may not be thinking of the mosque that they go to every day as an organization that they are a member of, but I would make the argument it is important. So in Egypt, there's much more religious infrastructure, religious organizations that provided Islamists with more resources for mobilizing voters into that country's founding elections than were available to their secular rivals. Whereas in Tunisia, which I hope this data kind of hints at, this relatively strong mixture of religious, non-religious, and labor-based groups meant that political contestants from across the Tunisian political spectrum possessed resources for mobilizing voters into the country's first democratic elections and beyond. So the difference I really want to say lies in the pre-existing nature of sort of the society. Now we can keep going back and asking, where does that come from? And one argument I would make is that these differences are functions in the underlying differences in the level of economic development between these two countries. So, modernization theorists have long argued, right, that economic development leads to a particular kind of civil society, that you get this kind of highly articulated civil society only in highly developed countries. And Tunisia is much more developed than Egypt. This is a chart of urbanization in Tunisia. So only 45% of Egyptians live in cities. Approximately 70% of Tunisians live in cities. Tunisia has a per capita GDP that's 30% higher than Egypt's. Tunisia has a lot more literacy than Egypt. So this is a chart that I made using literacy data that Gregory Clark from UC Davis put together. This is literacy in the British Isles over time. The way he gets this data is he looks at what percentage of people are actually able to sign their marriage contracts versus just putting their fingerprints. And so you have it from 1750 to 1900. And then what I did was I plotted contemporary Arab literacy rates on this line. And what you notice is that, Egypt, for example, today, with its approximately 30% illiteracy rate, is where the British Isles were in like the 1870s, okay? Tunisia's ahead. What I wanted to see Tunisia way ahead. It turns out that it's not, but it's ahead. And so the point is that, Egypt is somewhere where the British were almost 50 years before they got suffrage. The Tunisians are further along. And so there's, it's not surprising that in Tunisia, which is more developed, wealthier, that you would get this different civil society. The question, of course, is where does the differences in development come from? And I've tried to trace this back as well. And it turns out that even at the moment of the founding of the modern Tunisian state, and you compare that to the moment of the founding of the modern Egyptian state, Tunisia was richer. So I know the modern Tunisian state is 1957, but if you look at the income of Egypt in 1952, when Egypt had its free officers coup against the monarchy, and you compare its income to Tunisia's income in 1952, Egypt per capita GDP in 1990 international dollars was around 900. Tunisia's that same year was about 1220. So there's clearly some difference in these two places that goes back a long way. So the point of all of this is to say that economic and social structures are likely to be far more consequential in determining long-run democratic prospects than these questions of institutional design. None of the actors in the Tunisian story I've told you or in the Egyptian story I've told you are able to come to the table with an unconstrained set of choices. As Karl Marx wrote in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, men make their own history, but they don't make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. So in short, in contrast to the entire premise of this panel, I believe that the data shows that you cannot really choose your way to democracy. Thank you.